Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about the formal powers of the US presidency. This is going to be the first of 5 videos on the US presidency on the channel. The other one's going to be a bit longer and more detailed, so make sure to check those out as well. The PDF you can see on your screen you can find on the Politics Explained website as part of an updated textbook on US government and politics, where you can also find loads of other resources to help you in your politics A-level, including essay plans, everything you need to know, guides and textbooks, and a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in. Yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off with the parts of the specification this lesson covers. So this has a look at the formal sources of presidential power as outlined in the US Constitution and their use. This, of course, for the EdExcel exam board, but should be useful for the AQA exam board as well. So we're going to have a look at the role of the head of state and government, and we're also going to reference some presidents since 1992, but that will also be done in more detail in future videos. In terms of the questions this will be useful for, this will be really useful for 12 markers in terms of comparing the different powers of the president and the prime minister. And should also be useful for some 30 markers as well. It's never going to be like the basis of a whole essay, but it's really important to understand these key formal powers to pretty much answer any question on the presidency, including in relation to foreign policy, in relation to their relationship with Congress. You can also get a question on whether informal powers are more significant than formal powers. So, starting off, we'll have a quick look at an introduction to the presidency, and effectively, a way that is really useful to understand the presidency is that it's a very powerful office, but at the same time, a very frustrating and limited office. So first of all, a very powerful office. So the founding fathers designed the presidency to be very powerful. They're both head of state and government, unlike in the UK, where the roles are divided between the monarch and the prime minister. And the president, Theodore Roosevelt, once said, "I am both king and prime minister." The Constitution sets out that the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States rather than in a cabinet or a government as a whole. Therefore, the president themselves holds a lot of power, effectively complete executive power. They make the final decision on everything, and the cabinet is not a key decision-making body like it is in the UK. As the rest of the notes will show, the president has a great number of very significant powers, particularly in relation to foreign policy. Despite the presidency being a very powerful office, however, it's also a deeply frustrating office, due to the fact there are many limitations and checks on its power. And this was specifically designed by the founding fathers. They recognised the need for a head of state and government, and for that head of state and government to have significant power, but they deeply feared the president becoming tyrannical, and therefore gave Congress and the Supreme Court a lot of checks and balances against the president to prevent them becoming tyrannical and becoming too powerful. After leaving office, Obama remarked, "I think where I got frustrated at times was the belief that the president can do anything if he just decides he wants to do it," which I think much of the US population and much of the world as a whole effectively see the presidency that way. They recognise that it is a very powerful office. But he said, "And that sort of lack of awareness on the part of an activist about the constraints of our political system and the constraints of this office sometimes would leave me to mutter under my breath. Very rarely did I lose it publicly. Usually I'd just smile." So I think that shows how potentially many think that the president has more powers than they do, and they're in fact very limited from achieving their goals by the checks and balances in the Constitution, by Congress and the Supreme Court. What I thought I'd do is give you a quick run through of the presidents since FDR, because they'll be mentioned, or some of them will be mentioned in this video and in future videos, and it's just useful to have an idea of which party they were from and which era they were from. So what you saw was that through World War II and in the post-World War II period, you had a period of democratic dominance. So FDR, Harry Truman were both in for, FDR was for longer than 8 years, and then Truman was in for 8 years. A brief period of Eisenhower for 8 years, but then you had 2 more Democrat presidents in JFK and LBJ. Then in the following kind of 20-30 years, you have a period of real Republican dominance with Nixon, who eventually resigned due to Watergate, replaced by Gerald Ford. Then a brief period of Jimmy Carter, who lasted just 4 years, and then Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Reagan, a really powerful Republican president who lasted, and very powerful and popular at the time, lasted 8 years, and George H.W. Bush, less popular, lasted just 4 years, to be replaced by Clinton, who's there for 8 years. Then a switch back to Republicans for 8 years with George W. Bush, then Obama for 8 years, the Democrats, back to Republicans for 4 years with Trump, and now to Joe Biden. And it's yet to be seen whether he'll last 4 years or 8 years after the next presidential election. So yeah, that's it in terms of all of the presidents. And then finally, just the key part of the video we're going to have a look at is the formal powers of the presidency. The first key power is their power as head of the executive. So the president is granted all executive power in the constitution. They're therefore in charge of managing and running the whole of the federal government, like a CEO is with their company. This being said, they can't run everything themselves, so they have a key role in delegating power and managing the government, which has a large number of departments, including the cabinet, EXOP, and Office of Management and Budget. We're going to have a look at those in the informal sources of power video. As chief executive, they also have the power to nominate government officials. So they nominate around 4,000 government officials at the start of their presidency. These are politically aligned with the president and will be tasked with implementing their agenda in their particular department or area of policy. So this is different to the UK, where the cabinet is aligned with the party, but civil servants must be politically neutral. All appointments, though they're nominated by the president, must be confirmed by the Senate, which is a key check on presidential power. And they include the cabinet, so the heads of the 15 executive departments, and, as I said, thousands of other appointments. The vast majority of appointments are confirmed by the Senate, but recent presidents have been blocked from making certain appointments. So Trump had 3 nominations rejected, including Chad Wolf, who he nominated to the Department of Homeland Security, a pretty important role. And in 2022, Biden had 2 slightly less important nominations rejected. The president also has key foreign policy powers, so we'll have a look at this in a lot more detail when we look at the foreign policy lesson that's going to be kind of on the presidency, but also comparing it, foreign policy powers for the president compared to Congress. But crucially, their commander-in-chief, which as set out in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. And this means that the president plays a key role as effectively head of the US military. They have to approve all significant missions and a final say on important decisions, including the possible use of nuclear weapons. So Donald Trump made the decision to assassinate Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, which displays this role. He didn't have to ask for congressional approval. And as head of the US military, it was his final decision on whether to do so or not. Joe Biden also made the decision to pull the final US troops out of Afghanistan, completed in 2021, as well as the decision to move more US warships into the Persian Gulf following Hamas attacks in Israel in October 2023 in order to warn Iran against increasing aggression against Israel. Since World War II, US troops have almost always been engaged in a war somewhere in the world, from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan. So this role as commander-in-chief is really important because there were always key decisions to be made in relation to the military and foreign policy. This being said, there are checks to the president's control over foreign policy, including Congress's power to initiate war, the War Powers Resolution, and the power of the purse. But as we'll look at in more detail in the foreign policy video, there's a lot of ways that the president gets around this. Another key foreign policy power is that of the key formal foreign policy power mentioned in the Constitution. So all of these powers, which described as formal powers, are because they're explicitly written down in the Constitution and given to the president. And that's that they're the power to negotiate treaties. So they have to be ratified by the Senate in order to become operational, but it's the president's role to go out and negotiate them. The most recent ratified treaty was the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement that replaced NAFTA, and a recently rejected treaty was Obama's Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But as will be explored when looking at the president's informal powers, the difficulty in getting treaties ratified by the Senate has led to many presidents signing executive agreements with other countries that don't require the Senate's ratification. In terms of formal legislative powers, they have the power to propose legislation. So in the annual State of the Union address, they formally recommend legislation to a joint session of Congress of the Senate and the House of Representatives. And that gives them the ability to try and seek to influence the legislative agenda. So in Biden's 2023 State of the Union address, for example, he implored Congress to pass policing reform, immigration legislation, and codify abortion rights. Obama used his 2010 State of the Union address to focus on passing the Affordable Care Act, which he was ultimately successful in doing. His power is much more likely to have an effect on a unified government compared to divided government. Another key formal power, so written down in the Constitution, of the presidency is to sign or veto legislation. So the president has the important power to decide whether bills that get passed by Congress get signed into law or vetoed. For important bills they strongly support, and have played an important role in drafting and campaigning for, they often have photograph signing ceremonies, allowing them to take some of the credit. But they can also veto bills. So Obama vetoed 12, Trump 10. So in 2020, he vetoed the Iran War Powers Resolution, which would have limited the president's authority to use military force against Iran without congressional approval. Biden so far, maybe more now, has vetoed 8 bills. For example, and a key one was a bill that would have blocked his student loan forgiveness program, while there's also a few less important ones. It must be considered that Congress can override a president's veto with a 2/3 majority in both the Senate and House of Representatives. This is very rare, has yet to be happened to Biden, but happened once to both Obama and Trump. The final key legislative power that's written down in the Constitution is the president's power to submit an annual budget. So every year, the president proposes to Congress an annual federal budget for the executive, drawn up by the Office of Management and Budget. This then has to be approved by Congress, which often leads to complications, especially if there's divided government. And has actually in recent times led to 2 major government shutdowns, as ultimately the budget couldn't be agreed between Congress and the presidency before the deadline, which effectively results in the government shutting down until there is agreement. So it shut down for 16 days under Obama and 35 days, the longest in history under Trump. And then finally, key thing to have a look at is their judicial powers. So the president has the formal power to issue presidential pardons, which allow them to pardon and forgive individuals for federal crimes. This is a very controversial power, due to how it's sometimes used to pardon political allies or friends. The most high-profile cases when Ford pardoned Nixon over the Watergate scandal. So Ford replaced him as president and then pardoned Nixon, who was complicit in the Watergate scandal. Obama pardoned over 1,000 individuals on drug charges who had received lengthy sentences at the height of the war on drugs, a lot of them just for possession. And in terms of political allies, so Trump pardoned political ally Steve Bannon, who faced charges of corruption. Biden hasn't yet made loads of pardons, but has pardoned, or any kind of politically significant ones, but he has pardoned a number of individuals on drug, murder, and alcohol crimes. And he's ruled out pardoning his son, Hunter Biden, if he does, effectively, if he is arrested and charged with a crime. The president also has the power to nominate federal judges, which is a really important power, particularly those to the Supreme Court when there's a vacancy. This allows them to shape the court how they wish. So Trump was able to make 3 appointments, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, all of whom are conservatives, and this resulted in the shift of the court overall to a conservative direction and some really important decisions such as the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022. Biden so far made 1 appointment of Ketanji Brown Jackson in April 2022, the first black woman and former federal public defender to serve on the Supreme Court. This being said, this isn't like an exclusive power to them. Nominations have to be confirmed by the Senate. And when there's a divided government, the Senate has sometimes used this to politicize the process, such as when Merrick Garland was blocked from being appointed to the Republican-controlled Senate, being appointed by the Republican-controlled Senate in March 2016, as they argued that there shouldn't be an appointment made in an election year, even though a Republican Senate then did the exact same thing 4 years later with Amy Coney Barrett. So that shows how it has become a bit of a politicised process as well. The final key power we're going to have a look at, so we've looked at all of those which are powers, formal powers written down in the Constitution in relation to their power as head of executive. The final thing we're going to have a look at is their power as head of state. So alongside the president's formal powers as head of government, they also play this important symbolic role as head of state. So they represent the US in relations with foreign dignitaries and seek to unite the nation behind them in times of crisis as effectively the key person representing and in charge of America. This is particularly clear under Bush following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, where he addressed the nation and experienced a significant increase in popularity known as the rally round the flag effect. Some presidents are more effective at doing so than others, and it's a bit more difficult in the hyper-partisan environment of 21st century US politics, as it's very difficult for Trump to unite Democrat voters behind him, or Biden to unite any Republican voters behind him. Presidents use their role of head of state to drive US foreign policy and negotiations with foreign leaders. So Trump did so with high-profile meetings with Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, and Biden has driven the US response to the Israel-Hamas war in late 2023, flying to the Middle East and meeting with Netanyahu and other leaders. So yeah, that's everything in terms of the formal powers of the presidency, which, as I said, are those written down in the Constitution. There's going to be 4 more videos on the presidency, including the informal powers, a video on foreign policy, one looking at the varying nature of presidential power, and one final one on the key kind of debates and interpretations in relation to the US presidency. Let me know if you've got any comments or questions in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you, and I'll see you in the next video.